This week on the agenda, population decline. Is a falling birth rate a financial disaster in the making or a real opportunity to save the planet? The world's population stands at just over 8 billion. But while we used to worry about the world becoming too crowded, global fertility rates have fallen for the first time since the Black Death in the 14th century. By 2050, over 3/4 of countries will not have high enough fertility rates to sustain population size over time. This will increase to 97% of countries by 2100. Now, nearly all demographers anticipate that we shall reach peak population this century. And that has big implications for the global economy, with fewer people of working age and a huge strain on healthcare systems, especially as it comes as people are living longer. There were 23,000 centenarians in 1950, compared to 935,000 in 2024. The global number of people over 100 years old could reach more than 25 million people by 2100. So how will these future population trends reconfigure the global economy, society, and the international balance of power? Joining me now to consider that are Peter Elwin, Director of Fixed Income and Head of Food and Land Use Programme at Planet Tracker, and Stephen J. Shaw, demographer and director of the documentary Birthgap. Thank you both for coming on the agenda. Peter, let me start with you, because there are some parts of the world where the population is about to, or is already, shrinking. What's going on?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, birth rates are falling and longevity is increasing. So the demographic pyramid that we've been so used to talking about, we have more young people than old people, already on a global basis is essentially a rectangle. So we've no longer got a majority of young people. We're now pretty much sort of equal in many countries. And the trend is that that will continue. So ultimately we'll end up with an inverted pyramid with more old people than young people. And I think one of the things that's really interesting, obviously, you know, I'm very involved in the sort of climate and nature process. And, you know, this is yet another example of a trend that we've known about for really quite a long time, much like the climate and nature crises. And we've really done very little to address this, certainly pretty well nothing on a global basis, nothing to address the underlying causes. I'm sure we'll talk about politics. This is the year of elections, as many people have said. But I think as a species, we're really very bad at dealing with the longer-term systemic problems that we face.
We will talk about economic models and societal frameworks and where they are, how they're adapting in a moment. But Stephen, I want to talk to you because for your film, Birthgap, you travelled the world to discuss this issue. What did you discover?
Yeah, the reason I traveled was I couldn't accept that this was all being caused by local factors. I couldn't accept that what was happening in Japan was due to work-life balance, while in Italy it was due to, you know, high youth unemployment. To me, there was an obvious, the data was screaming out effectively saying there is a common theme here, and yet no one was looking for that. The common theme is rocketing childlessness across every single one of these countries. If you look at mothers going back to 1970 in Japan, 1980 in the US, 1970 in the UK, mothers today are having the same size of a family as they were decades ago. The only thing that's changed is delayed parenthood. People, I think, mostly deferring having a family, and that connects all of these dots. So whilst we try to look at policies that may work, the reality is many people are simply running out of time, and that's causing this tailspin, and it is a tailspin. No country's ever been known to come out of this downward spiral.
Let's borrow a little bit further into your investigation and the factors that you investigated.
Well, all the factors kind of wash out because you can find some possible cause that correlates. Indeed, these are often spurious, non-causal linkages that we find. And then you look at another country. I mean, take Germany. Education in Germany is free. Education is blamed as being part of the problem for this in South Korea and Japan. You know, taking long paternity leave is blamed in Japan, where I'm based. But you look at Denmark, and people in Denmark get 1 year off. So the reality again comes down to data and the trends. And one other fact I should put on the table from large-scale surveys and my own research, somewhere between 90 and 95% of women. We've got so much data on women, I'm sure it's men too, mostly. 90 to 95% of women either have a child or want a child during their fertile years. So the vast majority of people are in some way trying to, I think, juggle their lives to get on with the education that we've, as a society, told them to study hard and get as far along that path as you can and then get established in your career. Those are all great things, and I wouldn't want to see us going back in those things. But then someone turns 30, 32, and they might not have a partner, or they might go through a breakup, or their partner might not be on the same page. This is what's happening. It's what I call unplanned childlessness. And I've seen the tragedy as well. I've seen people who, in front of the camera for the first time, I think, talking to me, shed tears, men and women, because they had had a dream of having a family.
And I think the interesting thing on that, Stephen, is, one of the things that we still don't really know, but there are clearly linkages between, for example, plastic pollution and the rise of microplastics, which we're finding sort of, throughout human society, including in fetuses. There's the rise of other forms of pollution as well. We've got a great deal of medicines, for example, that are ending up flowing through the human body and ending up in our watercourses, and therefore in the sort of the food chain on which we depend. And the list goes on. So I think as a species, we are polluting our environment in ways that we really don't understand what the consequences are. There's evidence, for example, that male fertility is beginning to decline. So sperm counts are declining. So again, going back to your point, if starting a child is delayed, and then you have a combination of both female biology making eggs less potentially sort of survivable, and male fertility falling off as well, so sperm counts are falling, then you get a potential situation where people, as you say, want children but are not able to conceive. And I think all of these influences are combining to the extent that essentially we are living in yet another expression of the crisis that we've generated by polluting our planet, in essence.
So let's talk a little bit about what impact all of this is going to have. I mean, Stephen, people make the world go round. We're the workers, we're the teachers, we're the soldiers, we're the caregivers. So how exactly will an older and smaller population affect the workforce?
Yes, and some people, I think, perhaps nationally assume that shrinking populations just mean there's fewer people, but it's not like that. It might be like that in 100, 200 years from now, but the journey from where we are now, what we're going to have to go through this, what I call inverted world, where there are, as we've said, so many more old people to support. And that affects everybody. When you go to a doctor looking for an appointment, and there's simply so many more older people relative to the younger people to try and get an appointment, it's not just older people are going to suffer here. I think the other point as well is in terms of shrinkage of towns and cities. People like living on top of each other generally. It seems to be that we like urbanization everywhere. And I think what will happen is a younger, more affluent people will migrate to cities and towns that are vibrant, or indeed countries that are vibrant. And what will be left behind is a patchwork quilt of decaying cities and towns and villages where there's going to be, frankly, a lot of very lonely people. I've seen it. I've interviewed some of these people already in rural Japan, and you see it in their eyes. They're just decimated by the collapse of community. We're losing community here, as well as all the financial implications of that.
So huge financial implications, that loss of community, and maybe a future with low fertility, population aging, and eventual depopulation, which is going to lead to all those things. Peter, how is that going to increase pressure on already squeezed health systems? And is anything being done anywhere to mitigate that?
Well, I think, Stephen has really sort of outlined the pressure on the health systems very clearly. So, for example, in the UK, we already face a health system where we've had underinvestment for a couple of decades, and now we're reaping the consequences of that. And that's being combined with an aging population and, of course, a shrinking workforce or a shrinking taxpayer base. And I think, at the moment, there are roughly 5 working people for every over 65-year-old. By 2100, there'll be 2. So your sort of working population relative to old people is going to more than halve over the course of the next 75 years. And that's a dramatic shrinkage in the sort of the population that will be able to actually do the work, provide the taxes to sort of support older people. So clearly, one of the things that has to happen is people can't retire at the same age. They have to continue working to support themselves. The other obvious fact, as sort of Stephen was mentioning, is you get literally empty villages. You'll get empty factories. We've reached peak 5-year-olds already. So the writing is on the wall for elementary schools and for elementary school teachers. There will literally be far fewer 5 to 10-year-olds over the next 10 years than there have been in the past. So these sort of systemic shifts are all observable and predictable. I think right at the moment, there is really essentially nothing being done about that. None of the politicians want to talk about tax burden of old age care. None of the politicians want to talk about the costs of solving these problems and the societal changes that will come, unfortunately.
We're talking about the overall global trends, but, Stephen, it is different from place to place, isn't it? In some regions, there is a young and growing population. So where is there still a baby boom? And how do you think that might be a resource for the global economy?
Well, the reality is that boom, as you call it, is only happening in sub-Saharan Africa. Everywhere else now is effectively below replacement level and falling rapidly. Even many states within India have birth rates as low as parts of Europe. So sub-Saharan Africa does have a higher birth rate. It's above what we call replacement level. But even there, the average woman in sub-Saharan Africa is having 1 fewer child every 15 years. So by around 2050, 2060, Africa will be in the same position the rest of the world is in. So we're all in the same path, but there will be growth in Africa. I mean, population trends tell you where growth's going to be. If I were a younger person, to be honest with you, I'd be thinking of spending time there because, it's going to be booming. I guess, there's 2 sides to that coin. There's risks with growth, and who knows what Africa will actually turn out to be. But I'm confident that Africa has a bright future from population dynamics point of view.
And perhaps then we'll see more migration to other countries that have those shrinking workforces. Now, Peter, in 2023, China joined that list of countries where the population is falling. What message do you think that sends to the world?
Well, I think that's a really interesting statistic, as Stephen was alluding to India. So China and India have just sort of crossed paths demographically. China is now on path to have a shrinking population. Their replacement rate is lower than Japan's, and sort of just over 1 child per woman, whereas India, as Stephen mentioned at the moment, is still sort of growing, but on a path to plateau. Japan is obviously the sort of the poster child of an aging population and the impact that has had. China illustrates very strongly the effect that a one-child policy has had. And the interesting thing is that started in, I think it was 79, stopped in about 2015, but the effect is still continuing. Culturally, there's been a shift away from having sort of lots of people having lots of children. There are now many more people not having children in China. And again, I think it's just an illustration of the fact that we make decisions to do things or not to do things, often not to do things because they're easy, and those decisions build up over time. So the effect that we're seeing playing out in China is the effect of decisions made 20, 30, 40 years ago that are now playing out. The effects were always obvious, but going back to the point I was making earlier, they weren't dealt with at the time, and now the consequences are being suffered. So I think China really is going to be a poster child for the trends that are coming down the track for many other countries.
Stephen, let me bring you in on this, because even as the world gets older, we have the same economic models, we have the same societal, social safety nets. What are the consequences of failing to adapt and rethink?
Well, you're absolutely right, and I will add to that. When I did my MBA, 30 years ago, all you were taught about was growth models. And I believe it's the same today. Growth is going to become a thing of the past. It's going to be about managed decline. Which companies, investments, governments, nations, cities, towns can best manage the decline they're going through. There'll be opportunities in this for some, I'm sure. But the reality is the models that have worked in the past successfully have all in some way, directly or indirectly, benefited from increasing populations. Whether we like increasing populations or not, the world as it is today, and you can go through almost every ideology across the planet, it's not specific to the West or the East, we've all benefited economically from growth. Those days are over, and we need to start thinking rapidly about how to move into this new era of managed decline.
Peter, you've already said it, we're in the middle of the biggest election year in history, and I'm wondering whether a more evergreen agenda is actually a vote winner, or if anyone is prioritising the longevity economy.
The longevity economy, the sort of concept that we need to focus on sort of, doing old age well, I think that's very important. I think for me, the green sort of agenda and a greening of the economy is actually essential for the longevity economy. If you think about what will happen if we don't address the climate crisis, for example, we'll end up with significant extreme heat days. That's very bad for old people. It's pretty bad for young people as well, but it tends to get off older people first. We'll face rising sea levels, we'll face all sorts of food system crises, and so on and so forth. So I think to really sort of empower ourselves and equip ourselves for a world in which there are many more older people and fewer younger ones, we actually need to address the climate crisis and the nature crisis now, and use that as the base for really trying to design a world in which we're focused on sort of equitable growth of well-being rather than simple growth of consumption. And I think the other risk is that people often say, oh, well, at the moment, the problem with the planet is there are too many people. If we had fewer people, the planet would be better off, and so would the rest of humanity, the ones that remain, as it were. That's a pretty sort of superficial analysis, because the challenge is not really how many people there are, but how they behave. And I think the risk is that we have a shrinking population, but a growing number of older people who continue consuming resources well beyond the planetary's boundaries. And actually what we really need to do is reconfigure the economy so that we are all increasing in well-being along the lines of a longevity economy. We're growing old well, but we're also doing so within planetary boundaries in a way which is ultimately sustainable.
Peter Elwin, Stephen J. Shaw, thank you both very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Still to come here on the agenda, building resilience, how the world can prepare for an older, smaller population. Welcome back to the agenda. Before the break, we heard about the economic downsides of a falling and ageing population. But might there be an upside, especially when it comes to the Earth's natural resources? With me now, Haleh Nazeri, longevity economy lead at the World Economic Forum, and Dr. Jennifer Sciubba, demographics expert and author of the book 8 Billion and Counting: How Sex, Death and Migration Shape Our World. Thank you, both of you, for coming on the agenda. Haleh, I'm going to start with you. Fewer babies means fewer workers and consumers driving growth. Where do you see the upside for global ecosystems?
The way I look at this topic, to be totally honest, is as a way of reframing the way we've done things in the past and to rethink how things will look going forward. So as we're talking about people living these longer lives, these potentially 100-year lives, what we like to do is to help people reframe it as something different than what we've known before, which is this idea of a three-stage life, which is you go to school, you work, and then you retire. That kind of part of life is from a previous time zone at this point. Going forward, we need to think about a multi-stage life. And what that means is, you go to school and then you'll go to work and perhaps you'll take some time off. And perhaps it's to have a baby, perhaps it's to upskill, perhaps you don't mean it, you've turned into a caregiver, and then you go back into work. So the way that we like to think about this longer life isn't necessarily, is it what it looks like, is just, this is happening, people are living longer, how are we gonna adapt to it? How are workers gonna adapt to it? How are individuals gonna adapt to it? And how can the public sector adapt to it?
So you're thinking of it, there really is a real shift in mindset that needs to happen. I mean,
complete mindset, exactly.
I mean, Jennifer, why do you think that a future with fewer people is maybe an opportunity rather than a big challenge?
Well, it's a challenge if we decide to act like we're still living in another world, as Haleh said, and it's an opportunity if we do open our minds to that. As a student of population history, when you look back, even to very recent times, you see that policymakers and those in power worked so hard to get fertility rates down and to stop population growth from happening. So when their wishes came fulfilled, now all of a sudden they are panicked about wanting to raise that. And I think that is a mindset issue, and it's also a structural issue. It's a mindset issue in the sense that they're never satisfied. And I always think of it like Goldilocks with her bowl of porridge. It takes her a minute before she gets there. It's too hot and then it's too cold. And I think right now we've gone from too hot to too cold, and not really understanding that there may not be such a thing as just right. We're chasing some elusive sweet spot that you're never going to actually get because it's just theoretical. And that sweet spot tends to be this replacement level fertility rate. It's also a structural issue because if we leave all of our structures exactly as they looked when we were in an era of what seemed to be infinite population growth, then of course there will be challenges. So we have to adjust.
What about gender equality, Jennifer? I'm wondering if we could maybe interpret lower birth rates as a signal of an increase in that.
Well, it depends on what level, because I, for a long time, thought a lot like you did. And in the last 2 years, I've started to change my thinking. So for the most part, when we think about the shift from very high fertility rates, 5, 6, 7 children per woman, to low replacement level or just under replacement level, we know that that's because women have increasing opportunities to get work outside the home, that they are better educated, and that they have more rights and freely available family planning and so on. But when we're starting to see these shifts to very low fertility rates, and this we're thinking about 1 child per woman on average, or in South Korea, 0.6 or 0.7. In Seoul, it's 0.55 children born per woman. I actually wonder if that is not an indicator of a lack of progress in gender equality. And in fact, South Korean feminists will tell you that they are increasingly opting out of this system of marriage and the norms that are reflected all throughout society that do not favor women and allow them flexibility, allow them that kind of equality. So it's an answer that is both yes and no.
There are 3 main factors that we look at, which we call the 3 kind of strikes against women. 1, women live longer than men. We live on average 5 years longer, so we have to save over a longer period of time. But we're the main caregivers. It's approximately 70% caregivers are women around the world, and that requires us to leave the workforce, not make money, and also not have that retirement money. And the third big thing is we make less money than men. The World Economic Forum put out its Global Gender Gap Report yesterday, which is a big favorite of mine. And once again, we have about 134 years to reach parity. That's 3 years longer than last year. That's 5 generations away. So these are the issues I think about when I think about gender equity and people living a longer time, and what we need to do to ensure that women have equal access to what they need for a longer life as well. I think it's a critical issue for everyone to consider going forward.
So considering concerns around climate change and depleting resources around the world, increasing food insecurity, I wonder if population decline might actually make it easier to address environmental issues.
I don't think we should assume that that's what will happen. I think that when we look at what is causing climate change, when we look at the tremendous use that we have of natural resources, rising standards of living are in there. And that is a global goal. So financially, we want the world to have rising standards of living. And if we accomplish that goal for those 6 billion people that right now are not in the poorest and not in the richest countries, then we're actually going to see a much bigger footprint on the planet in the future. And it'll be those countries that are the richest that are shrinking, but that aren't changing any of their consumption habits, of course, as we know, and I'm one of them. And so it won't be this automatic process. I think it's really dangerous for us to assume that it will be. Instead, we need to think about how do we simultaneously meet our goal of raising up those that are in the middle and at the bottom and who've barely seen any budging there. And those at the bottom, in fact, economically also have the fastest growing populations, and they will throughout the rest of this century. So the same challenges of the past will continue in the near future.
So, Haleh, in terms of raising people up like that, if the population is going to be older and smaller, how do we maybe need to rethink economic models?
Sure, that's a great question. I think we need to look at it from each kind of stakeholder, to be honest. I think we think about what the private sector has to do with this and what the public sector has to do with this. For the public sector, I think they need to take a really long, hard look at the way we've kind of structured things in the past, both from, well, in certain countries from a healthcare standpoint, what that looks like and how to keep that solvent, and also from a pension retirement standpoint. For private sector, I think we need to expand what we think of as what a worker looks like going forward. I think many older people are going to continue wanting to work, either because they will need to work for more money or because they want the community aspect of it. They enjoy being engaged, and some people can't imagine having 25 years of retirement and would like to still be engaged. So I think it's back to that mindset shift again of what we need to think about regarding this issue going forward. And I think the mindset shift crosses every single line. And what I would love to happen is if this topic became as important or as critical as climate change, which also affects everyone. Demography affects everyone, climate change affects everyone, but we don't seem to be as prepared for it as we could be. So that would be my big ask, is if this was elevated to the topics that's on election debates and the front page of the paper, to be honest.
So that mindset shift is really important, but that's going to cost money. So Jennifer, I'm thinking what we're talking about here is a real need to invest more in a resilient future world. In which case, what would you like to see governments doing?
I would first like to see them stop just trying to raise fertility rates. Right now, that has been basically the only approach that low fertility, quick, rapidly aging countries around the world have had. They just say, oh no, how can we stop this from happening? Well, demography is really just math. It's already happening. And even if those rates go up now, this is the issue that we will face for the rest of my life, certainly. So they need to stop focusing on that. And instead, they need to start thinking about reforms like more flexibility in the workplace. I think this has come out with what Haleh has said as a thread throughout everything. She said flexibility in our own mindsets, of course, which the government cannot change our own mindsets, but they can enable those mindsets. Still, in a lot of countries, there's mandatory retirement. There's tremendous age discrimination. So older workers, even if they want to work, they cannot come on board. We also even have it doesn't sound like a very sexy topic, but like housing reforms matter. So I travel all around the U.S. and try to think about resilience for aging, and zoning laws will come up. Some townships will not allow multi-generational housing. Well, it's hard to have resilience. It's hard to have a solid care structure in place if you don't have those types of zoning laws. So we can think all the way down to the local level about resilience, and it's not all done at the national level.
Jennifer Sciubba, Haleh Nazeri, thank you both so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out @The Agenda Show on TikTok.
Coming up on a future agenda, shooting for the moon. As Chang'e 6 returns to Earth, we'll examine the future of lunar exploration. But for now, from me, Juliet Mann, and from all the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.